Good afternoon. Today I shall be giving you a very brief preview of Elizabethan theatre. It is commonly accepted that the roots of Elizabethan drama lie in the cycles of mystery plays and the later morality plays that were such a feature of town life in the later Middle Ages in Northern Europe. In England, because of their implicit and often emphatic and strong Catholic ideology, the Privy Council, dominated by aggressive and doctrinaire Protestants in the last years of Henry VIII and in the Protestant rule of Edward VI and later Elizabeth, attempted the total suppression of these plays. That suppression was in many places in England resisted by the common public with varying degrees of success. For example, in the Coventry cycle plays, which covered the drama of man's fall, redemption, and salvation from creation through to the last judgment, the history of man's future or mankind's future, were being performed well into the 1570s, that is, into the early teens of young Shakespeare, who might just as well have run down the road in Stratford to see them. There is evidence of many more towns having leave play, as the records of tiny Bishop Stratford, Hertfordshire called it, than there are surviving texts, and in the Beverley, Yorkshire records, we can glimpse people even being auditioned for the parts in the plays. There are records of performances of more or less complete cycles in Kendal, in Chester, in Norwich, until even later, and some evidence that the memory of these plays was vivid and first hand in the areas of the country further from easy government control as late as 1644. The fact is that the religious plays performed the theatrical language of Shakespeare's and Johnson's generation, which we moderns may not even recognize. The cycle of mystery plays, usually performed in midsummer around the feast or holy holiday of Corpus Christi, were a communal effort in which the various organizations, guilds, and fraternities making up the community took responsibility and pride. Moreover, the plays often were the occasion not only for expenditure but also for the collection from the crowd of substantial amounts of money for the purposes of the church or the community in general. The nearest they had to stages was, in some cases, what can be called the pageant cart. We might even call it a float, as it were, often very elaborate and frequently with three levels, which signified heaven, earth, and hell. Scenery there was, to all intents and purposes, none, though props might have been elaborate and spectacular. Mostly the drama took place with amateur actors drawn from the community, whom one might recognize as one's neighbors in the everyday space of the street. The whole world effectively was the stage on which the drama of salvation was enacted. When permanent theatres came to be built, that symbolism is carried over seamlessly in cultural terms. They can't help drawing on this inheritance, and it is interesting to look at the names people call these buildings. The cycle play's narrative was fundamentally religious. The morality play's narrative was essentially allegorical. In both, there was a mix of the comic and anarchic, the serious and the holy. They are interdependent, inextricably mixed, difficult to compartmentalize, as they are in life itself. The narrative is very stylized, as we see, and as it had to be amateur actors, it had to rely significantly after year on fixed ways of performing roles, of doing things, on a recognizable and quite familiar iconography. With an audience gathering, shifting, performing, and talking in a street, this formulaic pattern is crucial, and the inheritance from it lasts a very long time. One consequence of this must be for us to recognize in all Renaissance English drama some sort of a readiness to see individuals against a type, to think symbolically and allegorically. We are dealing with a non naturalistic, as it were, but very vivid drama, which Shakespeare excelled in, for example. We should accept that stock characters, like the familiar Machiavel, can be a very potent way of releasing and exploring ideas and allow a considerable variation to be played on them. The cycle plays, whose stories, with all its mixture of intense importance, that is, religious importance and relevance, and grim humor and broad comedy, was repeated year after year and provided an equal space where the community explored its own identity, myths, and values, and allowed within the ritual structure of the year and within the prevailing structures of the social order an area of what can be termed Bakhtinian carnival, some form of a licensed disorder. That attitude to an expectation of drama did not die overnight. It is a part of the expectation of the plays of Shakespeare and Shakespeare's contemporaries. Once we have clearly established that, that is the matrix in which the imaginations of the audiences of Elizabethan stage formed, and the dramatists are often members of the audiences, and therefore one can then acknowledge the importance of their influences. There were also influences of the Latin tragedies of Seneca, for example, a gloomy, very stylized but gripping homage to the Greek tragedy lost throughout the Middle Ages, and which only a few Elizabethans perhaps would know. The influence of the Roman comedies of Plautus and Terence, much studied and performed in the schools and universities of the Elizabethan age, and the Commedia dell'arte tradition, deriving itself from Plautus's clever servant comedies, with which Italian troops brought to France and occasionally to England, the mark of which is most pronouncedly seen in the comedies of Ben Jonson and even in Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors, and The Taming of the Shrew. But all of these different traditions of theatre converge in forming an expectation that a new play would be very alert, sometimes ironically to its predecessors, borrow their dramatic languages, and often play variations on their recognized themes, just as is so popular, for example, in today's times. And Shakespeare and his contemporaries, customers and viewers, that is, people who visited the theatre to see a play, they differed from us in another way. The Renaissance audiences were just that. They often went to not to see a play, but to hear it. The word spectator is first recorded in English, significantly in 1586, and its first use in a drama is in 1600. We must assume that an audience of very skilled listeners, alert to the slightest nuances of language, of versification, of prose style, of rhetoric and tone, must have been visiting the theatres in order to see and hear the plays. It is therefore important that we recognize the primacy of the word rather than vision or sight in Elizabethan culture. And there is a good ideological reason for this as well. For the Protestant reformers set their faces against the wealth of painted, carved, and glazed representations of the saints and martyrs with which pre-Reformation churches were filled to the exclusion, they thought, of the attention due to the holy word of God in the Bible. It is a small step from that to accusations of idolatry in breach of the second commandment of Exodus 20, for example, and in a culture where many believe that literally, indeed, the devil roamed about as a roaring lion, seeking whom he might devour, and appearing in the likeness of an angel of light. There was a distrust, even fear of visual illusion. That is one reason why, in the plays of the period, players quite often stress that they are players, not the people they pretend to be. For most members of the audience, plays did not tell a new story, and anyway, on the second visit, a person knew the story already. You did not go to know what happened in a play in terms of plot. People went to see what burden in auditory terms could be made to carry by these plays. A good example is the history play, and there are far more plays we might loosely call history plays than any other in the entire corpus of English Renaissance drama. In history plays, people were aware of the stories, they were aware of the historical themes on which these plays were based, but they were nevertheless encountering issues of politics which might have been too dangerous to be discussed or consulted in the current times. This inheritance, as it were, is the bedrock on which the history plays of the Elizabethan age were built. Sometimes that foundation is openly acknowledged, as it is in the process of the seven sins in Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, or when Shakespeare's Falstaff is made to refer to the driver of Lath of the Vice in the old morality. And sometimes it is much more covert, but it is never absent and affects the way things could be seen, even when the world of the medieval cycle drama has gone forever. The conventions of the Elizabethan drama were an amalgam, as it were, of inherited material, sentences from classical or proverbial sources, maybe imagery from Virgil, Seneca, and Ovid, tropes and figures from various rhetorical figures and sources, stories from classical and English history, from Chaucer, from Bible, stage groupings of tableaus, sometimes termed presentational imagery, from old plays, from churches, from city pageantry. These could be fused together in the theatre, and a skilled playwright would add his own stamp, as it were, to the finished work. Only a small proportion of the known plays survive. It was inevitable that writers working at the speed of these dramatists should evolve some conventions, recoverable perhaps only in parts. For tragedy, they at first relied on Kidd and Marlowe with their highly individual reforming of Senecan traditions. In this way, a body of plots, a range of character types, and a set of maxims grew on which anyone could draw. Such a body of material is of little value in itself. Those dramatists who used it in an unenlightened way produced shapeless and incoherent plays, which formed most of the corpus, as it were, of the Elizabethan drama. But the great writers formed a true convention to which each could contribute, strengthening each other. Revenge plays share a certain criticism of life, and the genre is only a vehicle for it, unified and made poetic by the imagery and idiom. The essential structure of Elizabethan drama lies below the level of narrative or character. They essentially lie in words. The greatest poets essentially are the greatest dramatists. They innovate, they distill, and they unify the most heterogeneous material. It is perhaps in this ability or lack of it that the Elizabethans ensured popularity or otherwise of the plays they saw, and here we can say with a fair amount of conviction that both Marlowe and Shakespeare stood out among the crowd of Elizabethan playwrights. Thank you.